Despite the vast history of intertwining economic, political, and social affairs, China, Japan, and Korea are by no means considered to be on friendly terms. In this episode of extremely brief history, we'll be exploring the reasons for this massive rift in international relations in 10 minutes or less. So let's get going. For centuries, China, Japan, and Korea have coexisted as cultural powerhouses in the Asia-Pacific region. However, their relationship in ancient history is almost harder to keep track of than what of Mr. McNeil's rants. So for the purpose of comprehensibility, and to stop the audience from going to sleep, I'll be focusing today on the more modern sources of regional tension, starting in the mid-19th century. Despite recognizing itself as an independent nation, much of Korea's early history is characterized by the sense of subservience to the Chinese dynasties. In some instances, there are even records of Korean kings paying tribute to the rulers of China. This sparked the formation of a sibling-like dynamic. China looked out for Korea as a bigger, stronger brother, or sister, might look out for their younger sibling. In turn, Korea occasionally did things to help China, like a younger sibling might lie to their parents about their older sibling's whereabouts. In the most basic sense, Korea was independent but acted as an informal tributary of China, one of the only examples of its international perspective at that time. Otherwise, Korea was a rather sheltered nation, not keen at the concept of interacting with other nations, and more than content to focus purely on domestic interests. For this reason, it was given the moniker the Hermit Kingdom. For decades, if not centuries, Korea enjoyed its relative freedom from international affairs, developing its own unique culture, influenced only slightly by the culture of their neighbors, the Chinese. However, this all changed upon the arrival of Western powers in Asia. Most symbolically, the 1853 arrival of an American fleet of black ships, named for their iron hulls, led by Commodore Perry in Japan. The clear disproportion of military power, frightening Japan, combined with overwhelming economic superiority, was enough for America, and many other Western nations, to impose upon Japan a set of unequal treaties, as was common practice of Western powers in Asia at the time. From one perspective, this almost certainly appeared to spell out the end of Japanese exceptionalism, except it didn't. Japan was quick to learn from Western powers and decided that, unlike China and Korea, they wanted to pursue Westernization, what they saw as equivalent to modernization. Japan quickly went through what was known as the Meiji Reformation, which, while not particularly relevant to this topic, allowed them to really boost their military, their industrial capabilities, and then led them to this understanding that they had the right to go into Japan, or into Korea, and impose almost the exact same unequal treaties that were imposed upon them by the Westerners. In the most basic sense, the Meiji Restoration inspired in Japan a need to express their militaristic and industrial advancements. Additionally, Japan saw themselves as superior. They were the ones that adapted, while China and Korea had not. Thus, Japan, who had always had their eyes in Korea, decided it was time to express their supremacy, and quickly decided to wage almost a proxy war with China in Korea. This became known as the First Sino-Japanese War. After this minor proxy war within the Korean government rose to become an all-out war between Chinese and Japanese forces in Japan, or Chinese and Japanese forces in Korea, that eventually ended late in the 19th century, in 1895 to be precise, when China sued for peace. However, it didn't go as Japan was hoping for, given the display of military power that they put on. They were bullied by the same Western nations that had forced them to open up, and they were forced to give back to China much of the land that they had taken. Many Japanese felt that they had once again been bullied into submission by their Western counterparts, a belief that eventually led to the formation of a school of thought in which the only circumstances under which Japan would gain the respect of their imperialist enemies would be by the establishment of their own empire, one across all of Asia. In a continuation of the push to control Korea that had led to the First Sino-Japanese War, Japan annexed Korea as its own colony in 1910, followed by the conducting of a total war against Korean culture by the new Japanese rulers. However, the China that had once protected Korea was, itself, not in a place to act. After almost 300 years of continued rule, the Qing dynasty was finally overthrown in 1912, marking the end of China's dynastic history. The ensuing power vacuum hindered the Chinese ability to protect itself, much less Korea. Thus, from a Chinese viewpoint, the 1910 annexation of Korea went almost entirely unopposed. In the following decades, China remained unable to establish a centralized government powerful enough to exert its influence across all of mainland China, much less internationally. For this reason, in some regions, warlords ended up holding more power than any form of national government, a weakness manipulated by Japan as it continued to trend in the opposite direction of China. Rather than becoming a weakened nation, Japan was quickly turning into a powerful empire. In an attempt to further exert influence, Japan sought control over most of northern China, a desire initially manifested in attempts to manipulate local warlords and capitalize on the ownership of railroads, and eventually, upon the 1931 Mukden incident in which Japan claims China blew up one of its railroads, leading to the invasion of Japanese forces, followed by the establishment of Manchukuo, a puppet state of Japan, in 1932. Over the following years, tensions continued to grow as Japan continued to seek further influence in China outside of Manchukuo, leading to the development of pre-war tension, which reached its climax in 1937 during the Marco Polo Bridge incident in Beijing, which resulted in the declaration of war between China and Japan, marking the official beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, a war that would prove crucial to the development of modern China, Japan, and Korean relations. Occurring simultaneously throughout the war was the Japanese oppression of their Korean subjects, manifested in the attempts to suppress Korean culture. The most notable instances of this included the barring of students from speaking Korean at schools, the destruction of cultural and historical sites, texts, and artifacts, and the Japanese movement to have Koreans adopt Japanese names. Basically, Japan was trying to destroy any remnant of a Korea separate from Japanese influence, and remold the nation into a shining reflection of Japanese exceptionalism. This already occurring cultural repression was further compounded by the outbreak of the war. As Japan became more and more engaged, Korea became a prime source of supplies, even going as far as to export over half of their crops to Japan, leaving many Koreans starving. Furthermore, hundreds of thousands of Japanese citizens flocked to Korea to find jobs, increasing job scarcity and further compounding the suffering of Koreans under the Japanese. As for the war itself, Korea continued to be manipulated by their Japanese rulers. Almost immediately following the outbreak of the war, the Japanese army began accepting Korean recruits. By 1944, service to Japan was mandatory. In total, it is estimated that over 500,000 Koreans were killed during the war, nearly 2% of the total population. Even more Koreans faced what was perhaps an even worse fate. Almost 750,000 Korean women were taken back to Japan to serve as prostitutes in brothels intended to serve members of the Japanese military, becoming perhaps the most stark representation of the atrocities committed against Korea by Japan, as well as representing the complete degradation of Korean culture and the lack of care for Korean life by the Japanese. Ultimately, the suffering of the Koreans under the Japanese ended following the conclusion of the Sino-Japanese War, which had blossomed into the Pacific theater of World War II. In August of 1945, following their independence from Japan, Korea was divided into two zones, separated by the 38th parallel. The north occupied by the USSR, and the south occupied by the United States. In lieu of the plan to reunite the nation under a democratic government, two distinct systems were formed, each taking on the ideologies and policies of their occupying nations. The North became the DPRK under Kim Il-sung, while the South became the ROK under Syngman Rhee. These two systems quickly developed a strong tension, as felt across the rest of the world, reflecting the looming ideological battle between communism and anti-communism, manifesting into frequent skirmishes. Nearly 5 years after regaining Korean independence, Korea was even more fractured than before. In 1950, the DPRK invaded the South with alarming success. However, it didn't last. By the end of the war, the border remained almost unchanged, and Korea was, by no means, unified, all costing over 5 million lives. Even today, the tension has not subsided. 75 years after gaining independence from Japan, two Koreas are constantly on the brink of war. This time, perhaps even more destructive. Aside from inter-Korean diplomacy, Korea and Japan are still at odds. In my own experience, many of my Korean friends have claimed to still have a strong disliking for the Japanese, going back to the Japanese abominations against Korea. And to think that all of this, now, almost 75 years later, stemming from the Sino-Japanese War, and even earlier, the Japanese attempts to open up Korea. But the purpose of this documentary is not to depress you or to bring down the mood. Instead, it's important to draw light to the profound impact of Japanese imperialism on Korea, and hopefully serve as a lesson on what happens when a nation attempts to wipe out an entire culture for personal gain. This has been an episode of Extremely Brief History, and until next time, Jagbyul, Sayonara, and Zaijian.